Well, hello, podcast listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Doctor's Corner. This episode of the Doctor's Corner is brought to you by Eagle One Resources.
Hello, my name is Russell Hooper. I'm the owner and operator of Eagle One Resources, LLC. Eagle One Resources is a veteran-owned business that specializes in leasing expedited freight equipment, namely gooseneck trailers. If you're starting your expedited freight business, commonly referred to as hotshotting, and you have a truck with no trailer, if you're building the capital to buy your own, if you're trying to raise your credit score to purchase your own trailer, if you're saving for your next big purchase, expanding your business, or simply testing the waters, lease your trailer from us before you buy. We offer great rates to fit your particular situation. You can compare our rates to any others, and we have references. Our trailers are DOT inspected and come ready to work. Please give us a call to work out your special deal. Again, my name is Russell Hooper. I'm at 972-228-2673, and our email address is eagleoneresourcesllc@gmail.com. Thank you for considering leasing from us, and let's move it.
Hello, podcast listeners. Welcome to the Doctor's Corner, where we usually provide 30-minute comprehensive literature reviews offering our subjective evaluation and ratings of whether a compilation is a 5-star compelling read, a 3-star average read, or a 1-star, a less than compelling read. Well, today we have a guest, Dr. Neal. Dr. Neal, it's a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
Dr. Neal is an accomplished author, professor, and historian. She holds a PhD in African American Studies and have worked with World Teach, a nonprofit subsidiary of Harvard University. She served as the Director of Education at the University of Texas and has taught at multiple locations to include Texas State University, University Texas at Dallas, and several community colleges. Dr. Neal, is that an accurate summation?
It is. As you know, with most academicians, my list of schools with whom I have taught is quite extensive, of course, beginning in graduate school with community colleges and then different universities where I earned my graduate degrees, and it's an extensive list, yeah. But you're right. I went to college, I went to graduate school, and I'm a historian.
Very nice. Well, let's go ahead and get started. Dr. Neal, can you share a little bit about your book titled They Were There, American Slaves Speak?
Absolutely. What I did here for this book, I read and quantified 1,279 slave narratives. I was looking at some very specific topics in some very specific areas, and it occurred to me as I worked through my graduate program that so much of the history of the slave community in our country has been written from the perspective of the planter class. The planter class, the master class, call it what it is. It's the white people who wrote the history of the black slave culture. So what I discovered with slave narratives, and specifically the WPA narratives, was a way to ascertain what the slave experience was by listening to the slaves.
Okay, you mentioned WPA. Did you want to identify for the listeners what that means and what it is?
Absolutely. The WPA is the Works Project Administration. It was launched under the New Deal by Franklin Roosevelt. And what this specific project did, the writers component, was they were fanning out unemployed musicians, artists, anybody they could find that they couldn't send to one of the programs like the CCC or the TVA. So it sent writers, teachers, authors across the South to record the narratives of slaves just before the slave population died out.
Okay. And in your book, you addressed how slaves were treated in Texas and in South Carolina as it relates to medical care, living quarters, and punishment. Why did you focus on Texas and South Carolina, and what were some of your findings that you can share without giving all the details away?
Well, I specifically looked at these two states. It was really pragmatic more than anything else. I specifically, as I was living in Texas, I wanted to learn more about the slave experience in Texas, and I really needed a state to compare that to. Now, I chose South Carolina for a couple of reasons. South Carolina was the oldest slaveholding state in the Union. Texas was the youngest. It was only a slaveholding state for 16 years before it seceded and joined the Confederacy. South Carolina was a rice crop. They grew rice in South Carolina. They grew corn in Texas. South Carolina used first-generation slaves. Texas used fourth- and fifth-generation slaves. There were other considerations like population density, climate changes, but really what it came down to was it was a good juxtaposition between, it was the second oldest. Virginia was the oldest, but there weren't enough records. So South Carolina presented a great comparison with adequate records to make a good judgment. I learned that you didn't want a plank bed because snakes would come in through the holes where the bed's attached to the walls, and it was better to explore. I learned that you can chew cotton root as a contraceptive. I learned in terms of medical care, I learned that, as one slave said, yes, they had access to medical care because you wouldn't let a mule die because you've got too much money invested, so why would you let a slave die? Wow. I learned from another slave that cabins were built like you built a hog pen. One thing I learned is that if you were going to punish a pregnant woman, you dug a hole in the ground to lay her belly in so you didn't damage the property.
Wow. Your book is very telling, so I can appreciate all the details. I mean, I actually learned a lot with, me being African American, and just to read the words on the page were so profound. You did a great job. I understand that this is a consolidated compilation of your dissertation, and it presents as a metadata analysis. It was very profound. So can you tell me, conceptualizing the act of slavery, and as a subject matter expert and in accordance to your finding, can you pinpoint how white Americans were able to completely disempower a race from state to state? When you mentioned the first generation, you went third and fourth. Are you able to pinpoint that?
No, absolutely. And it's quite, I don't even know, it's profound, I think, when you realize that it's not hard to do. It is just not that hard. The first thing to realize is that they didn't have to do this from state to state to state. When the Constitution was written, they included what was called the 20-year clause, the clause of 1808. What that clause said was you would no longer be able to import slaves into the country after 1808. Now, you'd still be able to sell them around. You can sell slaves from Virginia to Arkansas and Mississippi. Go for it. But we're not going to have any new slaves come into the country. What's important about that is the founding fathers genuinely believed that slavery would die out. And in fact, I was astonished to learn in every single country in the world, when they abolished the importation of slaves, slavery died out in 2 generations. This is the only country where not only did slavery not die out, it continued to grow. So they didn't have to do this from state to state to state, because once we hit 1808, you weren't getting new slaves from Africa that you had to introduce to the population. By that point, you're dealing with slaves who are 2 generations, 3 generations removed from their African roots. So here's what you do. First thing you do is you make their religion illegal. The English baptized their slaves when they left Africa, and then they were taught Christianity. They were taught select parts of Christianity. They were taught turn the other cheek, love thy neighbor as thyself. Probably my favorite is the Exodus thesis from the book of Exodus. Suffer in silence, for your reward will be bestowed in the afterlife. The second thing you do is you separate families. You separate grown children from elders, you separate children from parents, you separate husbands from wives, because people with no one to fight for are much more docile. And finally, you eliminate the ability to communicate. Now, initially, this was as simple as separating people from the same tribe and placing them with different plantations, with people from different tribes. You can't talk to each other. This is continued later by making it illegal to teach a slave to read or write. This way, they cannot communicate with each other. And again, isolated people are much more docile. Interestingly, this is how we get the Juneteenth celebration in Texas. Slavery was, and I'll use this in quotes, abolished on January the 1st of 1863, but slaves in Texas didn't find out until word of mouth traveled to Texas on June 19th because no one could read. So that's what you do. You make their religion illegal, you separate the families, and you eliminate their ability to communicate.
Wow. Wow. I believe many Americans, period, not just African Americans, would definitely appreciate the pure candor in that.
It's really heartbreaking because once I recognized how simple it was, I saw it everywhere. It's what we did to the Native American population. It's what we did to the immigrant population at the turn of the 19th century. And we do it. You want the worst example, honestly, is probably Nazi Germany. Separate the Jews. Send them to concentration camps. Send the Polish Jews to German camps and spread them to other places where they can't communicate in a similar language. Separate the families and make their religion illegal. And it's horrific. I mean, they weren't, I don't even know. There's generational enslavement, and then there's mass slaughter, and you just look at it and start going, how are people so awful?
Sure. Well, I noticed that in the outset of the book, you had documented that first-generation slaves, the colonial narratives. However, it went straight to third and fourth-generation slaves. What happened to that second generation of slaves?
What we've got there is we've got colonial slaves. These are slaves in our country from 1609, and we really cut that off with the writing and ratification of the Constitution. Those are our colonial narratives. Then we've got our antebellum narratives. And the antebellum narratives are the period that covers the antebellum South. Historians use a cutoff as 1808 with the clause of 1808 forbidding incoming slaves into the country until the Civil War starts in 1861. Those are your antebellum narratives that were captured. And the colonial narratives have their strengths and their weaknesses. The colonial narratives have lots of references to Africa. They usually culminate with escape, purchasing their freedom, which makes sense since someone still had to write it for them. And then your antebellum narratives it's a lot of propaganda, to be honest, because people, abolitionists in the North, were using them to, I guess, convince, if you had to convince anyone, of the badness of slavery. They used them to further their political argument. These were sometimes written by the slaves themselves. So after the antebellum narrative in 1861, we have a void until the WPA come along during the New Deal.
In reading the book, there were so many factors that I found shocking. I can't begin to name them all, but many more facts that I did not know or simply lost sight of. One of them being that, and you mentioned it earlier, cotton root was used as a contraceptive. According to the two Texas slave narratives, and another one being that Ellen Craft disguised herself as a man and traveled from Macon, Georgia to freedom in the North. And then another second category of narratives detailed that Henry Brown concealed himself in a box, a 2 feet wide box by 3 feet long, and shipped himself to anti-slavery headquarters in Boston. So can you share a couple more categories that just shocked you as a white American?
So let me see. Other categories or slave stories. So Ellen Craft and Henry Box Brown, these are really the form that narratives take in the colonial narratives and largely in the antebellum narrative, in that these are the exceptions to the rule. These are the incredible, these are the, oh my gosh, can you believe, that's amazing. But the vast majority of slaves did not disguise themselves as men and take trains to the north. The vast majority of slaves did not ship themselves in boxes. And that's the part of history that's always intrigued me. It's not the exceptions to the rule. It's the millions of slaves that just lived and died. And this is all they ever knew. Those are the stories those are the voices that really speak to me. And they're, some of them are absolutely heartbreaking. There was a slave that was whipped for playing with a doll that belonged to the master's child. And you have to stop and think, good night, how old was that little child? It baffles me. When you read a narrative from a man who says when he was talking about being punished, when I got whipped, I just thought it was part of being alive. I think probably the most poignant thing that I read, and this was many years ago that I did this research, and it still speaks to me. It's harder now as a mom, is the slave that said, I don't really remember what my mother looks like, but seems like I remember she cried the day they sold me away and took me from her.
Yeah, that's heartbreaking.
It's terrible.
I can't imagine. I really can't. So as diversely inclusive as America is today, what were some of your challenges you experienced as a female, white American, teaching African American studies?
Oh my gosh. The road is long. Let's start there. I have to give credit to my graduate programs. I was never given any grief about what I wanted to study. Nobody ever said to me, that's going to be hard. No one ever said to me, are you sure you want to do that? No one. All they ever said was, that's a great idea. How do you want to do this? Who do you want to be on your committee? How can we help you? So in retrospect, that kind of gave me an idea that this wasn't going to be an issue. So you can imagine, I walked into my first class. All these young black kids are looking at me like, what are you doing here? And I'm bebopping in. I think I'm 26 years old. Hi, guys, I'm going to teach you Black history. To be like, no, you're not. So, I can laugh about it now, but, I drove home in tears more than once. I started planning my day to get to campus early to sit in my car and psych myself up that I could do this. And I think the hardest thing for me was gaining my students' trust, figuring out how to actually talk about race in a historical context with young black students. Let me explain that a little bit. I cannot read passages from my own book to my own students in my own class because I quoted the slave narratives, which are written in dialect.
Sure.
So trying to find ways around that. I worked very hard. Initially, I just ignored that this was going to be an issue and thought, I've never been in a class where a professor had to explain, I can teach this class because, ever. And I thought, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to justify why I'm here. But what I realized was that my students weren't being unkind by any stretch. They were not being unkind. They were paying attention. They were taking notes, but nobody was challenging me. Nobody was asking a question. They were keeping me at an arm's length. So finally, after, it was probably a month into class, I just had to tell them, look, I get that this is uncomfortable for you, and let me be really clear. I am not going to tell you what it is like to be black in America today because I don't know. I am going to tell you what it was like to be black in America in 1814 because I know more than you do, because I've studied it. You do not come out of your mother's womb with some innate knowledge of your cultural history. You have to learn it. And I'm here to teach it to you. And once they figured out I wasn't going to sugarcoat stuff, I was not going to make this sound like it really wasn't that bad. Then they were like, well, first they were mad that I was white and I shouldn't be teaching the class. Then they were mad that I wasn't black. Then it got to be, you should be black. You know more about this. I'm like, guys, I'm doing my best. I think the hardest thing for my students was when they realized they'd been misled, often by public school teachers, maybe by their families or places of worship. And let me be really clear. That said, I do not think people are purposely lying and misleading youth. I do think they're poorly informed. You know, for example, we have this myth that Europeans stormed the shores of Africa and stole people into slavery. It's called the triangle trade. The Europeans took manufactured goods to Africa and traded them for slaves. Slaves were being traded by their tribesmen. Later, tribes were starting wars with other tribes to get prisoners of war to trade into slavery. So how do you talk about that without making it sound like it's not white people's fault, which it obviously is? In 1860, less than 1% of the white male population in the South owned more than 50 slaves. But we have this plantation legend that every plantation was gone with the wind, when in fact the average number of slaves owned by a single planter was 5. So it's just, you know, there's this distortion about Abraham Lincoln, that he was this great abolitionist who freed the slaves. And, you know, Lincoln said, if I can end the war and free the slaves, that's great. If I can end the war and free some of them, that's great. If I can end the war and not free any, I'll do that. He was not a crusading abolitionist. The Emancipation Proclamation was written on September 22nd of 1862, and it gave the southern states 100 days to surrender, and he would maintain slavery as it existed in the Union. This was a military decision. This was no moral crusade to free the slaves. So that's hard for my students to hear that kind of stuff from a young female white professor. That's very hard for them. But honestly, you know, my students come around. Mm-hmm. I think the most lasting impression at this point is every single time I tell somebody what my degree is in, I get some form of, oh, that's so interesting. Here it comes.
Absolutely.
So what inspired every single time?
Well, I'm sure. Just real quickly, because I know we're getting ready to wrap up here, but in the book Elkins, I believe it was Stanley Elkins, so it's written that he contends that racial victimization was a product of unopposed capitalism and exploitation designed for the economic gain of the white planter class. Now, although we do not have slaves, you know, walking around America right now, do you think that same idea or manifestation of that idea exists today?
Wow, that's an intense question. I don't think there's anything wrong with capitalism as a system, provided it's some type of, I don't even know what I would call it, a humanistic capitalism, a giving a kind capitalism. I do believe that we should have a lowest common denominator. There should be this is the very bottom that we will allow our citizenry to exist in. And I think people have an obligation to be kind to their fellow humans. And what I often see is people with an awful lot of money say, hey, I earned this money. Okay, generational wealth, we'll just overlook that. And then as people work their way up from maybe impoverished to less than impoverished, or middle class to upper middle class, then it becomes, well, I need to hang on to all of this, or I'm going to slide back down real quick. And we get ourselves trapped in this cycle where the only person we feel like we have to help is ourselves. And I think that's a dangerous place to be. I think it leaves people out in the cold. I think it leaves people with no options. I think it leaves children stuck with poor or inaccessible medical care, with bad education. If you cannot get a good education, you are powerless to change your world. Powerless. I think it's wrong that we have people in this country who can't afford to feed themselves, can't afford a good education. You know, maybe it's by their own fault. Maybe it's not. Frankly, I don't care. I feel like it's our obligation to not let people live impoverished, regardless of their color, creed, race, gender, whatever it is.
Sure.
I have no idea if I answered that question.
No, you did, and you answered it thoroughly, and I believe your work was thorough and very insightful. Throughout your academic journey, your professional career, and even in your personal life, now, saturating yourself with such an intense, difficult topic then and now. How has that changed you, if at all?
It's made me, this is going to be interesting. It's actually made me envious of the African American community. There is a camaraderie of a shared experience within the African American community that I have not found with white people. I think the best example I can think of is that there's this legacy of slavery you find in linguistic patterns. African American women can address each other as sister, and men can address each other as brothers, and there's aunts and uncles and grannies and who are probably not related to each other at all. This is a legacy of living with people who were probably not your biological relationship. So you defined your family as those people who loved and protected you. Your sister, your brother, your aunt, your uncle, your mother, whoever it was, those were the people that lived with you, not by definition the people you were related to. That continues in the African American community in this country today that I am not privileged to. I cannot participate in that, and it makes me feel a little left out because I want to hold my book up and go, you guys should include me. I'm a really nice person. The proximity I have to the African American community, I am here by invitation. It is purely out of somebody else's grace that they'll say, hey, what's your opinion on this? How do you feel about this? I'm struggling with this particular topic. Can you help me work my way through it? And I'm fine with that. I'm fine that I'm here by invitation, but I do have to say that my feelings get hurt when I'm not invited.
Well, I must say you've done your due diligence. You've provided lots of hard facts, and they're very insightful. Like I said, packed with full of historical data that any one of the listeners can verify and offer their insight and feedback on. So, Dr. Neal, is there anything else you would like to share with the Dr. Corner listeners today?
Oh, gosh. Well, the best thing I can do with my child that my parents did with me was they shared their history. I grew up with stories. My family's British. I grew up with stories of my uncle flying for the RAF. I grew up with stories of my grandparents hiding under the stairs during the bombings of Coventry. So I'm very linked with my past like that. The more you can tell your children, your nieces, your nephews, whoever it might be, about your past, it's the best way to keep your legacy alive. And you have to study your past to know where you're going. And the way that resonates with me is you have to study your past to know where you are today. I wouldn't have any insight into race relations or how to speak to different people of different cultures if I had not spent years of my time learning about different cultures. And I think that's one of the biggest problems we have right now. I don't think the problem is so much in race relations as it is we can't talk about race. We can't say doodly pop without, you just can't. And I think that's a real problem. Unless and until we can talk frankly with each other about issues of race, I think we're stuck. There's a huge disparity in this country, and if you don't recognize it's based on race, you're an idiot.
Right.
There's two things about it.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't recognize we have a racial disparity in this country, something is wrong.
Sure. And that...
And you know what?
Go ahead.
I don't know how to fix it, but I have no idea how to fix it. But if we keep walking around talking about how it's not a problem, we're going nowhere.
In the book, I believe it was Phillips' primary argument claimed that slavery was a benign system of caretaking on behalf of the white population. So if we continue to think that it is benign,
years. I mean, there's whole works that it was referred to as the white man's burden. This was the white man's burden to take care of these poor Africans.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not kidding.
Yeah. I believe your journey, Dr. Neal, is called a lifelong doctoral pursuit based off of because you journeyed into an area where you didn't know what the repercussions would be and how people would respond to you because you were just simply interested in something. This was your intrinsic desire. So I can only thank you for journeying somewhere in a territory that, most people would not. Please share with the listeners where they can find your book and any contact information you would like to share.
Oh, gosh. I checked Amazon the other day because ego, and they were, I think they were down to about 10 copies, but they said there were more ordered, so you can get it on Amazon.
So, to learn more about Dr. Dr. Neal, feel free to send us an email here at the Doctor's Corner at thedoctorscorner2018@gmail.com, or feel free to post on our blog at thedoctorscorner.home.blog. Again, that's thedoctorscorner.home.blog. Thank you, Dr. Neal, for participating in today's interview. And listeners, go pick up a copy of They Were There, American Slaves Speak by Dr. Tara J. Neal. I assess They Were There, American Slaves Speaks as a compelling read. Dr. Neal provided raw evidence of the damaging effects of Anglo motivations for slavery in America. Thank you all for listening. And remember, you can find us on Facebook at The Doctor's Corner 2018, and you can also write us on our blog at www.thedoctorscorner2018.home.blog. Please listen, like, and subscribe.
This episode of The Doctor's Corner is brought to you by Eagle One Resources, LLC, specializing in leasing expedited freight equipment. Contact us at 972-228-2673 or via email at eagleoneresourcesllc@gmail.com.